Will a Golden Dome protect America? It's an ambitious and unprecedented defense project. President Donald Trump says it will shield the country from advanced missile threats, including those launched from space. But could it also trigger a new global arms race? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. US President Donald Trump has announced his latest defence plan, the Golden Dome. Estimated at a cost of $175 billion, it's designed to shoot down advanced missiles heading towards the United States. Using both ground and space to detect incoming projectiles, it will far surpass a similar system used in Israel known as the Iron Dome. But critics say it could prove ineffective and upset the balance of world power. So might the scheme lead to the militarization of space and threaten the global order? And could there be other motives behind Trump's announcement? We'll put these questions to our guests in a moment, but first, Imogen Kimber tells us more.
Golden Dome, a $175 billion defense system planned by President Donald Trump to protect America from the ground and from space.
The Golden Dome will be capable of intercepting missiles even if they are launched from other sides of the world and even if they are launched from space. And we will have the best system ever built.
The defense system is designed to detect and destroy missiles, similar to Israel's Iron Dome system that the US has contributed billions of dollars to. Israel claims it has a success rate of 90%. Trump says Golden Dome will have a success rate of 100% as technology has advanced and its detection system should be more sensitive, detecting missiles as soon as they are launched using a network of satellites.
President Reagan 40 years ago cast the vision for it. The technology wasn't there. Now it is, and you're following through to say we will protect the homeland from cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, drones, whether they're conventional or nuclear.
President Trump plans to ensure the project is completed before the end of his term in 3 years. Critics say it's wildly expensive and may be ineffective. Trump says,
Well, they're wrong.
Canada has discussed joining the project. China says it will violate the Outer Space Treaty that specifies the peaceful use of outer space.
The United States pursues an America First policy, obsessively seeking absolute security for itself at the expense of the principle of undiminished security for all countries. This jeopardizes global strategic balance and stability.
And critics say the project may also trigger further militarization in space and an arms race. While Russia says this is a sovereign matter, but warned the United States-Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue talks, designed to avoid a nuclear war, may need to be revisited.
This event will require the resumption of contacts on strategic stability. Today, with the treaty-based legal framework in this area either dismantled, expired, or deliberately terminated for a number of agreements, this framework must be rebuilt. It is both in the interests of our two countries and for the sake of global security.
For many Americans, Trump's Golden Dome proposal may be seen as the key to their security, or a drain on the public purse. For the rest of the world, it may be viewed as a strengthening of the world's primary superpower and cause for an even greater imbalance in global power. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Michael OHanlin, a Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. From Seoul is Youngshik Bong, a Research Fellow at the Yonsei University Institute for North Korean Studies. And from Munich is Marina Miron, a Post-Doctoral Researcher at the War Studies Department at King's College, London. A very warm welcome to all of you. Michael, I'll begin with you in Washington, D.C. Does the United States need this defense system that's being proposed by US President Donald Trump?
Greetings. Well, it's an important question and topic. I think that some expansion of the current system makes sense. As you know, we have a system already in Alaska and California that includes, I believe, 44 interceptors and is designed primarily to deal with a potential North Korean ICBM launch with a nuclear-tipped missile, a capability that North Korea has been moving towards, although we don't really know for sure if they could deliver that kind of a warhead against North America. The idea now would be, do you want to expand this to cover the whole country more comprehensively, to deal with potential attacks from the east, to deal with potential attacks from cruise missiles or drones or hypersonic maneuvering missiles? And my own view, your introduction, your introductory package was very good because it raised all the right questions. If you were to pursue this too dramatically and take Donald Trump's vision too literally and ambitiously, I think you could potentially create an arms race. But I think if you think of this more as an expansion of the existing capability to be a more comprehensive, limited defense, it may actually make some sense.
All right, well, let's unpick all of those questions further. Marina, the Pentagon has warned for years that the newest missiles developed by Russia and China are so advanced that updated countermeasures are necessary. What do you think an appropriate response to the developments that we're seeing in, say, Russia and China are? Is it the Golden Dome?
Well, what we know from Russia and China, and we have seen that being demonstrated by the Russian side, the new Oreshnik hypersonic missile, which has as many as 36 submunitions. The idea behind it is to demonstrate, of course, the range wouldn't allow for Russia to reach the United States. However, it would perfectly enable the Russians the second strike capability. It could target U.S. nuclear silos. For China, we're also seeing Chinese hypersonic missile developments, as well as this newly released promotional footage of an air or drone carrier, better said, that could reach the United States. So we see the adversaries, or U.S. perceived adversaries, are developing technologies which would necessitate some sort of defense. And we also know that their respective military publications do mention the fact that the United States doesn't have any capabilities to defend itself against these new developments. At the same time, on the official level, of course, there will be criticism. There will be criticism in terms of renewing the armed race, returning to the Reagan-era Star Wars, Cold War, and especially concerning is the weaponization of space, and specifically weaponization of the low Earth orbit and the potential debris it could create, because that would affect not just Russia and China, and Russia to a lesser extent, because it doesn't focus on the low Earth orbit as much as China does, and the United States, and of course European countries. But it could potentially limit the operational capacity of satellites currently located in the low Earth orbit. So it creates all sorts of problems.
Okay, Youngshik, let me bring you in there on something that Marina has already touched on. China and Russia have called the Golden Dome idea deeply stabilizing in nature. They've said that it carries strong offensive implications, heightens the risk of the militarization of space and an arms race. Does it?
Well, I am inclined to agreeing with Michael in assessing that some kind of updating and expansion of the current missile defense system of the United States is necessary. But the more important question is how the United States is going to do about it, because as you reported, it may trigger unwanted arms race. And at the end of the Cold War, the arms race was well managed in favor of the United States, because the financial costs of the arms race triggered by the Reagan administration's missile defense system actually cornered the Mikhail Gorbachev regime of Soviet Union in a very difficult position. So it ended in a very beneficial way to the United States, but there's no guarantee that this time it's going to repeat the previous record in favor of the United States, because the economic condition of China is very different from the economic conditions of the former Soviet Union.
Michael, the Golden Dome plan is, of course, a revival of that Cold War era effort by former US President Ronald Reagan, which didn't come to fruition because of the incredibly high cost. It's still facing that incredibly high cost now. But also, this was in 1983. There were huge technological hurdles, which this Trump administration is saying have been overcome. Have the technological challenges been overcome?
Well, it's not quite that simple. As my good friend in Germany just mentioned when she spoke, there are all sorts of options here, and some of them are better understood and better developed than others. Some of them could be more stabilizing or destabilizing than others. For example, if you were to literally put lasers or interceptors in space, in orbit, in peacetime, and have them waiting for any potential attack, that would be enormously difficult. As she just said, you would presumably have to test those to make sure they worked, and that would create debris in low Earth orbit that, unless you kept it very close to the Earth's atmosphere, could remain and interfere with the operations of other satellites for a long time. But to your question, we don't know how hard it would be to make those interceptors work. We haven't put interceptors in space before, and that would raise all sorts of questions about the weaponization of space. Space is already militarized. There are a lot of countries that have military capable satellites that do various sensing and communications, but we don't actually have weapons in space at the moment. And so that would be a big step. It would be a step in terms of its potential for an arms race, but it would also require substantially more technological development than we've made so far. And I doubt very much that we could actually create a constellation of space-based lasers at any affordable cost, even with today's technology. Maybe the interceptors, but probably not the lasers. I think the best kind of system is ground-based with sensors in space, communications satellites, but not actual weapons in space. I think that's the more realistic vision.
Okay. If you look at what China and Russia have done in space, Marina, I'll bring you in on here. Haven't China and Russia put, would you call the satellites, that they've put in space with the abilities to disable critical US satellites, which can make the US vulnerable to attack? Are those offensive weapons that China or Russia have put in space already? And how can the US protect itself against those?
Well, it's a difficult question because a lot of the information on any sort of weapons in space is, of course, classified on any Russian space projects. What we know about Russia, and I wouldn't speak about China in this particular instance, but what we know about Russia is that they have those so-called inspector satellites, which can approximate adversary satellites and potentially cause damage. The Chinese satellites have robotic arms, for instance, to repair. But so what we're seeing here as a broader trend is to have some sort of dual use objects in space, which, if needed, could potentially create damage. What do we do about them? You could do a kinetic kill of such satellite, but then again, what is going to happen in terms of an escalation? Because if the United States were to shoot down a Russian inspector satellite, say, that would be considered as an act of war by Russia. So what can you realistically do about that? There is no exact answer in terms of how can you protect your satellites from potential damage or even accidental, quote unquote, collision with Russian or Chinese satellites in orbit. That's also another possibility where you have kamikaze satellites. So you have different options there to operate, so to say, below threshold without causing an open confrontation, but at the same time disabling capabilities of your adversary, in this sense, the United States.
And Youngshik, last year the US said that Russia was developing a space-based nuclear weapon that could loiter in space for long durations, then release a burst that would take out satellites around it. Again, how should the US respond to the possibility of such threats?
Well, there's a possibility for Russia actually attaining such a capability, but dealing with a threat is loaded with many untested, unverified questions, as we have discussed. You are going to invest at least $175 billion for the next 3 years, and potentially $542 billion US for the next 20 2 decades for this. Although the United States enjoyed a long-standing bipartisan support for the missile defense system since the Reagan era, and with a contract with America initiative taken by the Republican Party in 1994, 1995, with Mr. Newt Gingrich leading the charge. But the technological reality must be accurately assessed before the United States military is going to make such a huge investment in this regard. And that shows that there's no better substitute for ground-based existing security arrangement to preemptively deal with this type of missile threats to national security of the homeland of the United States. Because you have to deal with the tyranny of distance and geography before you actually make an additional huge investment in the space as a next frontier.
And yet Donald Trump is focusing so much on space, isn't he? Michael, you've said that Trump is right that the technology for missile defense today is much better than before, but his ambitions will need adjustment. How do you think they need to be adjusted?
Well, first of all, I think the idea of building a comprehensive, large-scale nationwide defense that would be the equivalent of Israel's Iron Dome, but for a country 500 times bigger than Israel, is unrealistic. And I think we need to think of this as a way to prevent accidental or limited strikes or the threats thereof. And that's the goal that should be in our minds. Also, we should be thinking about some degree of nationwide protection against various types of incoming threats, including drones, which could be launched, from ships off our coast, or could be launched from Mexico or Canada, or even from within the United States. And so I think the idea of having limited defense for, let's say, 8 or 10 of the major urban areas of the country, especially those relatively close to the coast from which attack might originate, that's the more realistic goal. And in terms of the technologies, we know that ground-based hit-to-kill interceptors have come a long way in the last 2 decades or so. And that's the technology that I think is most ripe, as well as improved sensors in space and improved battle management systems using artificial intelligence. Those are the technologies that I think are within reach and that could be deployed in a relatively stabilizing way. Space-based weapons, by contrast, are nowhere near as close to fruition and raise much more profound questions about everything from international law to how you even build a viable system, because as my friend in Korea just alluded to, when you're in orbit, when you're in low orbit, where most of these defensive weapons would have to be, you constantly are moving, which means you're usually not in the right place to defend against a given threat at a given time. So you have to populate space with a huge number of interceptors or lasers in order to have even 10% of them in the right position at the right time. So putting things in space, putting weapons in space, is perhaps a bridge too far.
And Marina, as Youngshik said, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that it would cost around $540 billion just for the space-based component of this program and over the next 20 years. So is the cost actually going to prevent any such thing from even coming to fruition?
Well, we have to see it in the broader global context amid the ongoing so-called trade war and Trump's ambition to involve domestic defense industry in this project. So from my understanding, this will be an American-only project, and it carries this message that we see throughout Trump's speeches, America first. And so it will be an all-American system done by all-American companies. And I think in terms of costs, that could essentially increase the costs. I mean, the money is not unlimited. You will have to make budget cuts elsewhere in order to be able to afford it. Now, you will have to sell it politically. And can you make projections as far as 15, 20 years ahead in terms of what is going to happen, how the global geopolitical situation is going to change, and what kind of weapons the adversaries will be developing? Because now we see, of course, official statements by Russia, China, say North Korea, Iran even, right? But these countries will look for asymmetric ways to undermine the security of the United States. If the US invests a lot into space, they are going to invest a lot, as in Russia's case, for instance, in counter-space weapons. And they can be in the electromagnetic spectrum, they can be cyber. So there is a variety in the toolkit in order to undermine such system at a low cost, creating this cost dividend which the defender has to carry. And I think that in terms of cost, we all agree that the system needs to be updated, but how and to what end? And how high is the probability that the United States is at high risk of a potential nuclear attack? Perhaps other types of security threats are more prevalent and are of higher probability, and this is something that needs to be weighed into the calculation.
And Youngshik, whatever the US does do in terms of this system, could an advanced country like China, like Russia, deploy countermeasures to fool many types of defenses or simply build more offensive weapons, even nuclear weapons, to overwhelm them?
Yeah, as you mentioned, that this might actually worsen the security conditions of the United States, China, Russia, and other countries, because it may trigger unwanted arms race that China and Russia may become more aggressive. And so you have to see the whole picture. The completion of the constellation of satellites and space-based weapons may complete the protection of the homeland security of the United States. Then what about other countries which are security partners of the United States? They will continuously remain vulnerable to the potential missile attacks from hostile countries. So there will be a separation of security interests between the United States pursuing America First security policy and security partners of the United States like Japan and South Korea still remain quite vulnerable to missile attacks from hostile countries like North Korea. So although Trump administration has been insisting that what is good for the United States is good for the entire world and America's partners, so America First is not America alone. So we are all together in this. But that argument is not so persuasive to countries like South Korea and Japan, in all this consideration of the new type of missile defense system, which is going to be pushed by the United States.
Michael, there does seem to be some agreement that America's missile defense systems do need upgrading. But what do you see this plan realistically coming to?
Well, it's a good question. I think you have to break that down into two phases. The part that could happen on Mr. Trump's watch as president, which of course is only 3.5 more years, and then where we could be headed into the 2030s and beyond. And I'm just going to have to reiterate some of my earlier points, because anything you're going to deploy within the next 3 years is going to have to essentially be stuff that we know how to make already today. There's very little time left to do research and development and then procurement and then deployment based on the normal timelines for development of advanced weaponry by the Pentagon. And so this brings me back to my earlier point, and it allows me to make a comment in regard to what Youngshik just said as well. We already have quite good mid-range interceptors known as THAAD and Navy Aegis standard missile. These are the two systems. That one is ground-based, one is ship-based, and they are both capable against medium, but also perhaps longer-range incoming weapons. And they've done very well on test ranges, and they've also, the Patriot and others, have shown their capabilities in Israel and Ukraine in the last few years as well. So those systems, we know how to make, they work. We could deploy more with more of a comprehensive national approach here in the United States. And the good news for allies, especially Japan and South Korea, relatively small countries in a region we've already been focused on militarily for a long time, we already have missile defense systems, U.S. missile defense systems in Japan and in Korea, and also can bring more on ships. So I don't think we would be leaving our allies in the lurch. Admittedly, their position is more vulnerable, especially given the North Korean and perhaps the Chinese threats. But that's the kind of way you can think about this problem. Longer term, all sorts of things are possible. But all right, 3.5 years is not a lot of time.
Absolutely not. Marina, let me bring you in on what Michael is saying. Could those limited upgrades, I suppose you could call them, that Michael is talking about, that could be done in this presidency, handle a massive Russian or Chinese strike? Are they adequate?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm sure that the Pentagon would have run a lot of simulations in order to see how effective the current systems would be, and probably that was one of the reasons why it is necessary to develop, or rather to upgrade, the current air and missile defense system. And I think that in case of a salvo, it could be problematic at this stage. And at least from the Russian and the Chinese military press, that is what is being pointed out, essentially, that the U.S. Missile defenses are outdated, and if Russia combined their efforts with China under that constellation, that could indeed penetrate the U.S. Missile defense system, and thereby, actually, the idea is we're always talking in the nuclear deterrence logic.
Yeah. We only have a couple of minutes left in the program, and I want to bring Youngshik in on that point when the Kremlin spokesperson said that the Golden Dome could force talks between Moscow and Washington about nuclear arms control in the foreseeable future. And is that something good that could come out of this announcement?
Definitely. Who would say no to more talks to potentially reduce the armaments and the missiles on both sides? So they might be the virtue coming out this pursuit of a new plan by the Trump administration. It may not be the first line of defense for the homeland security of the United States, but it may be a facilitating effect to trigger a new round of a very productive, fruitful arms reduction negotiation between the United States and Russia, China, and North Korea in the future.
All right. That is our discussion for today. I want to thank all of our guests, Michael OHanlin in Washington, D.C., Youngshik Bong in Seoul, and Marina Miron in Munich. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.